Today we're looking at processors which operate on the dynamics of a signal, meaning that the property of a signal that we're interested in today is the amplitude. An audio signal's amplitude varies depending on the changes in the level of the sound source, such as the gaps between words or notes. However, even when the instrument we're trying to record isn't playing, we will still be recording the sound of the room, any background noises, and any noise induced into the signal from the equipment we're using. This noise adds up to create a noise floor on our recordings. Good gain staging, ensuring that our gain is turned up high enough to make the desired signal distinct from this noise floor, is essential to getting a good recording and ensuring that there is ample signal-to-noise ratio to be able to process the recording without issues. Additionally, the amplitude of the instrument in the room might change due to the player performing more or less softly, varying their distance from the microphone, or because their voice has partly given out whilst recording their 100th take of a vocal line. The differences between the lower and higher amplitudes of this part of the signal are known as the dynamic range. One of the main uses of a gate, otherwise known as a noise gate, is to look for the softer parts of a signal where the noise floor is most prominent, and turn it down or remove it entirely. A compressor, also known as dynamic range compression, looks for the more intense parts of the signal and again aims to turn them down, with the intention being that the resultant amplitude of the signal is more uniform. Let's talk about the amplitude of a musical signal. The amplitude shape of a musical note can be approximated using a simple graph showing the way that amplitude changes over time. For our purposes, this graph doesn't need to be linked to the numerical amplitude of our recorded signal. In this case, it is simply a tool to get you to think about how the processing you're applying to a signal will affect the shape of a note's amplitude. This graph is known as the Amplitude Envelope or an ADSR envelope. If you're familiar with synthesizers, you might have a good idea of how this works already. An amplitude envelope splits the amplitude of a note or sound into 4 parts: attack, decay, sustain, and release. Note that not every instrument sound will have a decay or a sustain, but all will have an attack and a release. Attack defines the amount of time a note takes to get to its fullest amplitude. This could be the slow swell of an organ or the quick intensity of a drum hit. The decay is the immediate drop away of this initial transient, such as how the initial pull of a violin bow drops away to the more consistent amplitude of the full bow, which would be the sustain in our envelope. The release is the amount of time between the end of the note being played and the sound fading away to nothing, such as the dying away of notes on a piano as the keys are released. Let's use this to plot a couple of amplitude envelopes for common instruments. We'll start with a drum hit. As you might imagine, a drum has an incredibly fast attack, so the slope of the attack is going to be very steep. It also has a significant decay, because the initial transient dies off quickly. There's no point in a single drum hit where the amplitude tends to stay the same, so as a result there's no sustain in this graph. The fading away of the sound after the decay is going to make up our release. Let's look at another example. We'll go back to our violin from earlier. When we pull the bow on a violin, the note immediately starts to play. To me, that first initial pull seems to die away just ever so slightly before the sustain, although that could be my bad playing. And then the full length of the bow is going to be our sustain. A good player can make the sustain sound really consistent, even when they're changing bow direction. And then when the bow is taken off the string, the sound dies away in a reasonably short amount of time, but not quite as short as the release on something like a voice. Now, there should be one pretty obvious caveat when we're talking about how we're playing these instruments and kind of graphing out their amplitude envelopes, And that is that it does depend on how you're playing the instrument. For example, some organs have a very slow swell at the start of their sound, meaning they have a long attack, whereas others come in with their sound straight away. It just depends on the type of organ that you have and the way that you're playing it and the way you've set it up. The reason I'm getting you to think about the amplitude envelope of notes like this is because both gating and compression can and will have an impact on the amplitude of the notes and sounds they're applied to. Additionally, both gating and compression have controls which use similar terms. A gate, for example, has a control which determines how quickly it opens to let signal through. If a gate takes a long time to open, it might reduce the amplitude of the transient or attack portion of a note. Just to make this extra confusing, this control on a gate is called attack. The attack of the note's ADSR envelope is not directly controlled by the attack control on a gate or compressor. However, the attack control determines how quickly these processes engage, and so that may impact the attack portion of the instrument's amplitude envelope. Whilst this similarity in terms is confusing, I find it useful to think about it in this way, because it allows us to theorize how a gate or compressor is going to affect the amplitude envelope of a specific note. I like to imagine the note amplitude envelope and the envelope of the processor superimposed over the top of one another. By doing so, I can predict the effect one will have on the other. Let's take this example. On the left, we have the envelope of a note. On the right, we have a gate which is applied to that note. We can add these together and consider whether the resulting amplitude envelope is appropriate for the instrument we're processing. We'll come back to this idea later, but first, let's look at how each of our processors work.